history at UCLA and an incoming faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA in some new field that they made called critical Black urbanism. I don't really know what that is yet, but I guess I get to define it. So today I'm not really a theorist, to be honest with you. So when I get asked to speak at these kind of things, I try to make some theoretical implications, but really I'm a social historian. And what I study is the social history of private property in South Los Angeles between 1920 and 1965. So basically like between real estate boom, when Black people were buying what I call the promised land, or what we call the promised land, and between the Watts Rebellion when we decided to burn it down. So there's this really critical period. And the way that history is usually told is, in terms of race and property, is usually about segregation. That the kind of primary concern of Black liberation is to defeat segregation and get like integrated into this kind of world of property. And so what I had an issue with was, and I think all of you would know, especially right now, is like when you go out into the street, especially during this pandemic, during the moratorium, like the daily life of property, I feel like wasn't being represented in the historiography. That we really didn't have a clear biography of private property and housing. And if we didn't have that, we really can't take an account of what this really, we can't assess it if we don't have that history. So like the thing that I say a lot is that private property, urban private property has a body count. And we know that there's people dying every day, there's people that are murdered. For me, I think violence is a part of a housing policy in the United States. So it's kind of what I'm doing. I go into the archive and I look for what I call property conflict. And so I actually don't study organized tenants movements. If I see an organized tenant movement, I'll look at it, but that's not my primary concern. My primary concern intellectually is to look at just how people are living daily and having these property conflicts in the midst of urban development, and what are some of the critiques? What's the intellectual history of Black people in South Los Angeles dealing with private property? And so from that study, I've kind of gone through a whole bunch of questions about like, and a big one, I think, especially when I started to approach the work, that I was really surprised about is that when I first went to start doing this research, I went to look for you, right? I went to look for tenant organizers, rent strikes, squatting, occupations, the things that we kind of imagine are part of the grassroots politics around housing. The fucked up thing about it is I didn't really find much of it, damn near any of it, right? And so then I'm like, well, why? And then when I went to the historiography, we already know who pops up in terms of like what place in the United States get written about in terms of tenant politics, and it's always New York. New York is always the exception. And it is the fucking exception, right? I mean, let's not bullshit. New York is the exception. But that was so strange to me. Like, how is it that we can just have basically this one city in all of the United States, like it's something as contentious as private property and housing, and it's been continually fucked up for the entire time we've had cities in the United States. Like, it's never been right. How is it that we don't see more either grassroots or formalized tenant politics in the United States? It just baffled me, right? So when I approached it, I was like, all right, so I have this theoretical kind of approach that I took from Robert Kelley, was about infrapolitics, saying that there was a hidden setup. So there's formal politics, which are visible, and then there's these other set of politics that are invisible, like infrared, infrapolitics. And so I went looking for that, looking for things like cartoons, jokes, fights, things that aren't related to voting or formal politics, but people having these conflicts over property. But soon I found out that was also that wasn't the issue. The issue wasn't whether we had hidden politics or whether we had formal politics. When I started looking into legal histories and about property, I ended up coming to a different conclusion, that it's not that like our property politics, some of it is hidden and some of it is formal. It's the fact that property is structured, our framework for property and governance in the United States from the jump, right? And so, and I'll kind of go through like what that means for us. So basically, like, let's just kind of get some of our terms in terms of like what property is. So like the kind of daily kind of common way that people discuss property is like, it's a thing, right? So like this landlord's building is the property. The building is the property, the land is the property. But property is actually not the thing, right? Property is the political relationship between us that enforces our rights and claims to it. That's what property is. So property could be anything, but it's definitely not the building, right? And if we don't have property, then, and in this sense, right now, I'm not talking about it in terms of any particular institution of property, but if we don't have it, then you just merely have possession of something. If I just pick up something off the ground and nobody recognizes my right to it, I just have possession. And then if somebody wants to jack me for it, if it's bigger and they just take it, then it's just theirs. So that's what property does. Property gives us this kind of political relationship between me, you, and who else? The state. So that's kind of like that triad of property. And so that means that property is a political relationship and it changes, right? Like this institutional property has been changing over the last 3 or 4 centuries. It's changed before that. And so it's always dynamic and it's always like this kind of moment of contestation. So when I was doing this research and I was trying to find that question of like, why is it that property politics don't kind of pop up as much as I thought they would in formal politics, I started to look at some secondary literature on basically the making of the Constitution. And I think this is a really particular moment, especially around rent abolition and debt abolition, because our founding, this is for the United States, our founding in this country in terms of the Constitution was based in a conflict over debt abolition. So that, so before we get the Constitution, we get the Articles of Confederation, right? And the Articles of Confederation were such a failure, and it was such a crisis, especially for the Federalists and Madison especially, because what was happening in the colonial United States in the late 18th century, when the Articles of Confederation were passed, was that states started to have these populist movements. They were capturing the legislators in now these kind of new states, and they were starting to abolish farmers' debt because these were poor white farmers who were at the tail end of a system of finance that extended all the way back to a London metropole. And so when there were problems with getting specie or getting paper money or solid coin, when they were getting called out for these loans, they didn't have anything to pay. They couldn't pay in any script. They would usually pay in the way that it usually was just like some kind of crop or something like that. They'd pay in kind. And so when they couldn't pay, it began a debt crisis in late 18th century America. And so they started to abolish and forgive these debts because they couldn't be paid. And so this was essentially the property conflict that made the Articles of Confederation just really untenable for the colonial elite like Madison and others and the Federalists. So when they went back to the drawing board to produce the Constitution, this was one of the central issues of a Republican government. How do you have, right, this is a central issue, how do you have a system of representative democracy where people have popular suffrage, but also protect the institution of private property from redistribution? How do you do that, right? And so this was one of the central concerns for Madison. And Madison was a smart motherfucker. I mean, let's not get this wrong. He had this down, right? Because Madison forecasted that the United States would end up being a majority landless population that had the right to vote, right? So that's kind of the dangerous thing. So if we're gonna plan to have a majority landless population that has the right to vote, then how do we keep them from redistributing property? How do we design a system of governance where we can protect that? And they can't even get it back, even if they have this popular right to vote. And so the two main institutions in which that happens, or the designs in which that happens, one is through large election districts, right? Because if you have really small election districts, then you can have a populist uprising. So if our election district was just South LA, I think our local can pull that off. Like, you give us enough time, we can get that together. We can have a populist uprising, and we can get up in there. but it's not, right? We live in LA. Somebody can go on the internet right now and find out how many millions of people we have in Los Angeles. How many representatives do we have on the city council for all these millions of people? 15. 15 representatives for millions and millions of people with very, very, very different and diverse class interests on the land. So that's one way of all the way from this kind of federal organization, and then our state and city governments match that. So by having these large election districts, it makes it very difficult to have any kind of populist insurgencies in our elected, in any kind of elected governance. But the other thing that does that is but sometimes that's happened, right? We've seen that happen. We saw it happen in Santa Monica with the passage of rent control in the late 70s. And so every now and then we can have in certain cities and municipalities, these insurgencies that then get power and then are able to pass legislation like rent control, which end up kind of being a version of redistribution. But the issue with that is, Madison forecasted that too. And that's what's so genius about it. It says, okay, so if they do get power, what's the other institution that's gonna check it? That's gonna check the redistribution of private property? Judicial review, right? And that's what always happens. And so that's what happened with our rent control laws. So for the most part, a lot of elderly white West Side people organized in the mid to late 70s during an inflation crisis and a crisis in rents and a crisis in taxation and crisis in property values. And this is where we got, there was like a tax revolt that was happening at the time. And so then these like white elderly renters were getting jacked up on their rents. And so they organized and forced the city council to pass what was then a temporary rent control and then permanent in the early 80s. But then what ended up happening? What did the landlord lobby then do? They either try to challenge it in court, or they then use a higher power, state power, to then kind of tamp down on that, on those tenant gains. And they've been doing it ever since. And right now we're in the process of trying to fight that back. So this is especially for a lot of autonomous tenants unions are very critical of like trying to pursue legal remedies for issues of tenant power, right? We want to build tenant power through tenant associations. We want to do tenant power through mutual aid. We want to do tenant power through that kind of grassroots building of power. But this analysis, I think, is very important because it was not just talking shit about the law, right? We need to have an analysis, and it's always going to be different for every country, because every country is going to have a different history of property and have a different history of governance. And so that structure of our governance right now is it's not necessarily preventing redistribution, right? But it's preventing us from getting political power to get to the instruments of redistribution. And so because the state is a sovereign, right? When you have property in the United States, you don't have absolute ownership. Who's the absolute owner of property in the United States? It's the government. If you die, nobody's your heir for your property. Who does it go to? It cheats back to the state because they're the sovereign. And that's the reason why they can do eminent domain. But the reason why property is so important in terms of, like, we think about it as this economic thing. Like we go and we study Marx and stuff like that, and it just becomes this economic concept. But property is also political, property is social, and property is also cultural, right? Because when people are talking shit about like in the United States about like freedom and all of that kind of crap, it's not freedom. It's a freedom structured by settler citizenship, structured by property. And so what we've done in this country is we've had to produce our identities, racial identities, gender identities, sexual identities, regional identities, nationalism, our citizenship, all through the concept and through the political relationship of private property. So then if we're going to discuss abolition, the rent abolition, right? We're going to have to deal with this issue of sovereignty. We're going to have to deal with this issue of how our Constitution protects from the redistribution of property, but then also we have to deal with ourselves. That means that rent abolition is also going to be a cultural project, and it has to be culturally competent. We were having this discussion the other day about like having a conversation in our local about rent abolition and about debt, right? And another organizer, Lupe, was like, I want to do a meeting in Spanish, right? And then we started to kind of talk about it, and you were like, oh yeah, what we can do is we could have a translator and da da da. And Lupe was like, no. I want to have the conversation in Spanish. right? Not in English translated to Spanish, right? In Spanish. And so I thought about, when I was thinking about this in terms of like property as a cultural concept and debt as a cultural concept, you have to have conversations about rent and debt abolition in like, you have to practice language justice, and it has to be a cultural conversation. And so we're then gonna have to start digging into our histories. I just have this timer here to tell me when to shut up. And so I'm gonna stop now. So one thing we have to do is we have to dig into our cultural history and start having cultural conversations about our identities, about meaning. And you could do it a whole bunch of ways. Go and find old cartoons that are making fun of landlords or whatever. I mean, every culture is gonna have a different set of kind of cultural tools to be able to discuss land critique and development critique and epistemology. So, you know, for example, for Black folks, you can go to Clyde Woods and blues epistemology. But folks are always going to have a kind of different set of cultural tools to be able to discuss rent and debt abolition. We can't just have these conversations just as purely economic or purely theoretical discussions. They must be cultural, they must be social, and so we have to kind of attack it on all sides. I had some other stuff to say, but I want to stop. But in terms of, I just want to share a few other implications of this. One is that the meaning of property is not constant, right? So this is such a significant moment because it's at these moments of crisis when people are fighting, when people are getting shot, when people are getting beat up, and all of this kind of stuff. When property is in crisis, it's a great time to kind of renegotiate and rediscuss what it means. The other implication is that that property is an institution and a concept, but then also that violence is a very important instrument of property. It always has been, so we have to discuss that. The other implication that I want to share is that so I got that, an object of government. I think that's everything I wanted to say in terms of implications. Oh, and then when we discuss kind of like how we use the state for redistribution, another reason why it's so hard to do it in the United States is because property is what we call the boundary of government power, right? So if we think about like, what are the powers the state has in reference to your property rights? One is taxation, the other one's regulation, and then the other one's eminent domain, right? And each of them has kind of ways of being defined. So there are tools for redistribution and abolition, right? But they're really, really, really difficult to get to. It's really difficult to take over taxation powers. It's really difficult to take over regulation powers. And it's really, really difficult to take over eminent domain. But we've already seen activists and groups use and currently trying to use things like eminent domain for redistribution. So these are the state powers that we can use. But if we're trying to transform what those state powers are usually designated to do, especially in terms of thinking about housing as a human right, or thinking about creating a commons or creating social housing, what the level of that threat, like the depth of the threat in terms of like how seriously to take this shit, is basically like thinking about something like abolishing slavery, right? Like that level of violence, that level of contestation, that level of like, this shit is in my body, I will kill you for my honor kind of thing. Like that's how serious this is when we try to fuck with private property and in concepts of property, deeply, deeply conflictual. Like it's just amazing. So if we want to get at that, right? It can't just be about like a surface level analysis of like what it's doing here and there and stuff like that. But it's part of your identity. It's part of how I define my masculinity, right? Like stay off my land, you know, all of that kind of like, bro, that stuff is so deep, you get shot real quick over that. So it's like we have to get down and we have to discuss that in terms of our identities and sexuality and race. Because then if we deny that, right, especially in South LA, property has been a big, big, big part of how Black people have defined their conceptions of freedom and liberation. Right now, it's at the center of it. It's right at the center. So if we're going to renegotiate that, we have to take that cultural history. We have to take that cultural history seriously for everyone that's going to be involved in our tenant union. I'm gonna stop there and then we can ask questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's incredibly interesting. And if folks are having questions like, Definitely write them down. Feel free to pop into the chat because we're going to do the other two presentations first, but then we'll come back to question time. So I'll go ahead and throw it to Julian.
Excellent. Wow, thanks, Mark, a lot. Talia, thanks for moderating. And Frank, I'm looking forward to your comments and the rest of our discussion. Okay, so I've got a slideshow here. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, no, not that. All right, can we see this? Okay, I think the little bottom's going to get cut off, but I don't think that's going to affect it too much. So here we are, no rent. That's my name. So first, truly decommodifying housing would require a complete overthrow of capitalism. People will be familiar with this quote probably. It's in the ATUN Points of Unity. As long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it's folly to hope for an isolated settlement of the housing question or of any other social question affecting the law of the workers. The solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production. And by the way, I have strike throughs in this just to help speed me along. So that's Engels, the housing question. So 1.A, collective ownership in a capitalist society does not alter all aspects of the commodity character of whatever is collectively owned. One or more aspects may be altered without fundamentally altering the others. Corporations are a form of collective ownership, though hierarchical. So what we're talking about here, right, is many forms of decommodification are a form of collective ownership. So as long as some aspects of commodification are maintained, housing costs can at best be limited, not reduced to zero. And meanwhile, capital will be forced to seek profit through other forms of exploitation. So decommodification doesn't eliminate exploitation, it displaces it to another sector in society. So this is an Engels quote. I'm actually gonna skip it, but it kind of a little bit where this next point I'm gonna show you comes from. It's also from the housing question. So rental housing is a commodity in at least 6 different ways. So first, as landed property that the tenant pays rent to use. Second, as a built commodity for which the landlord paid the builder or the previous owner who paid the builder. 3, as a built commodity that deteriorates through use and exposure, which the landlord sometimes pays workers to repair. 4, as a commodity that the landlord pays an insurance company to secure from decline by unexpected expense. Next, as a commodity that a mortgage lender is owed a debt for, and a commodity that the landlord pays taxes to the state for. So now we're going to look at 4 common forms. Actually, these are 4 common forms of decommodification. This is from a resource document called Communities Over Commodities. I linked that in the slideshow. I'll share that later. I'm just going to focus on a couple of these, but they're similar in the ways that they're limited or partial decommodification. So I'm going to focus on limited equity cooperatives, which are a form of long-term affordable cooperative housing, as well as mutual aid housing cooperatives, which are similar, but they eliminate some of the forms of commodification, I think. And then we're going to talk about social housing as well. So a limited equity cooperative, those are commodities because members buy shares. Shares contribute to paying the price of the land's ground rent. Shares contribute to paying the builder. Members pay their share for building repairs. Members pay their share of insurance. Members pay their share of the mortgage, and they pay their share of taxes. Mutual aid housing cooperatives own houses as commodities similarly to LECs or limited equity cooperatives, but they also build and maintain the home themselves. So still, the co-op pays the price of the land's ground rent. They pay the price of the material cost for building repairs. They pay for insurance. They pay the mortgage. They pay taxes. So again, we need to end capital to truly decommodify. Even social housing, if it were free at the point of use, owned by the state, is a commodity because it's built and maintained like the other housing commodities. I'm not going to go through the breakdown here, so we can save some time, but it's comparable. And people will have access to the slides if they want to kind of look at the breakdown. So next, a principal argument for plans to decommodify housing is that as a commodity, housing is speculated on by real estate and finance capitalists, leading some to keep homes vacant, causing gentrification by inflating rent overall, motivating evictions. But actually speculation is only a fraction, causes only a fraction of tenants' actual problems. So first, the latest data available shows that the vast majority of properties have been owned more than 10 years and thus obviously weren't bought to be flipped. So the data I'm drawing from is the 2018 Rental Housing Finance Survey, which is put together by the US Census. The median year of acquisition of properties was 2006. Less than a quarter of properties were acquired after 2010, and 5.2% were acquired after 2016. So that's pretty small, right? 5.2%. A plurality of landlords and are mom and pop, though the number is diminishing as LLCs and the like are becoming more common. However, LLCs are reportedly often run by individual investors. And this data that I'm going to show you also comes from the Rental Housing Finance Survey. So we're looking at the change over time from 2015 to 2018 here. So on the left, you can see that the individual investor is still, really the plurality, 47.8%, almost a majority. Second largest ownership type is the LLP, LP, or LLC. And then really everything else is much smaller in comparison. People often talk about real estate investment trusts. I actually couldn't get this graph to tag that, but it's this sliver here. It's also 1.8%. Real estate corporations, we can see, are 3.3%. And there's pretty significant change going between 2015 and 2018. So there's a big drop, 6.6% in individual investor ownership. A lot of that appears to be picked up by LLPs, LPs or LLCs. It's about 4.1%. And then we can see really, these other slivers, they're kind of shuffling around, but there's no, order of magnitude change we're dealing with here. So now this is Hyungjung Lee is a researcher who was a postdoc with the Harvard Center for Housing Studies. And this is kind of where I get this point, which I haven't had a chance to investigate further, but many individual landlords reportedly created their own LLCs. This is from 2011 to 2015, and transferred ownership of their property to protect themselves from liabilities and take advantage of tax benefits. So the kind of the notorious difficulty with researching LLCs is that, you have to look right at it, look into their corporate records to really know who's behind it. So we can't really know how many of these LLCs are part of large networks versus owned by individual investors. But there's reason to think that many of them are actually more or less individual investors. And as far as we know, landlords on average profit at a rate lower than the average small business. An estimated based on a 2018 survey found that average small businesses in the US had a 7% profit rate. Meanwhile, the 2018 Rental Housing Finance Survey indicates that the average capitalization rate for landlords was between 5 and 6.9%. And I'll indicate, and we'll see in this next graph, there's a low overall response rate, particularly from LLCs. So, there could be problems with this data, but it's the best we have. So you can see what we're looking at is the capitalization rate. So less than 3% is at the top. That's low, right? We're saying this is the average here is in the 5 to 6.9%.
I'm happy.
And then, when we kind of get beyond 7 to 9.9%, it really drops. Here we can see the not reported. I'm not going to dig too much into the data, but I just kind of wanted to introduce this basic point. There's not, huge, when we think of speculation, people often think of these huge speculative profits, but by and large, that's not what's happening for landlords. Also, simplification is far more common than gentrification. It's like way more common. So a report called the American Neighborhood Change in the 21st Century investigated 4 kinds of neighborhood change in the years between 2000 and 2016 in the most populated 50 regions in the US. And they found that what they call poverty concentration in central cities alone was more common than low income displacement in central cities and suburbs combined. And we'll have a visual of this if that's more clear for folks. But just to kind of clarify the concepts, when we talk about low income concentration, we're talking about the census tract is economically declining while the census tract is experiencing low income population growth. So that's poverty concentration. And then low income displacement is when the tract is economically expanding but the low-income population is declining. And just as a matter, kind of more generally, I refer to growth in low-income displacement as both parts of gentrification, and low-income concentration and abandonment as both parts of slumification. So here we've got the graph. We can see, really the bulk of what's happening is suburban poverty concentration. In central cities, there's actually more poverty concentration than low-income displacement in suburbs and central cities combined, right? So that's really what we're talking about. Mostly, we're talking about slumification in terms of neighborhood change in the US. It's way, way, way more common. So here's some maps just to kind of visualize that. And I'll tell you the maps are cropped. So the numbers here are suggestive, not accurate, but in the back of the slideshow, I've got links if people want to look at the originals. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but you can see that even just in this crop, looks about at best 50-50. There's probably more in this visual poverty concentration, but there's also plenty of displacement. And this is the Bay Area, right, in California. Now we're looking at Houston. We see actually quite a bit more poverty concentration. We can kind of see the geography here. The suburbs kind of are where there's a lot of the concentration happening, the displacements in the central city. Chicago, we're talking now, I think the scale here is changing quite a lot. There's no consistency in scale across these maps. We can see there's really a huge amount of poverty concentration happening in the greater Chicago area. And then Philadelphia, again, we're seeing similar, you see slumification in the suburbs. We see largely the displacement happening in the central city with a little bit on some of these outer areas. Okay, so what does we make of all this? Well, short of a full decommodification by social revolution, large-scale partial decommodification would be an enormous political undertaking that is nearly impossible to actually imagine. And Mark, I think you illustrate that really excellently. The form that imagining partial decommodification most often takes are the policy reports and proposals of progressive nonprofits. But I don't think that kind of imagination is ours in terms of the autonomous tendency of the tenants movement. And it's not going to agitate most tenants if that's what we focus on. So if our ultimate goal is to win livable homes for all, what do we talk about to win that? I think instead of talking about decommodifying housing, we should talk about abolishing rent. Full decommodification and full rent abolition amount to the same thing, but rent abolition, I think, can better engage and agitate the imaginations of tenants we meet and organize with. Decommodification, so why do I think that's true? Decommodification, if it speaks to anyone, speaks to tenants affected by gentrification, speculation, or those who could end up living in a housing co-op, which, as I've tried to show, is ultimately relatively few tenants. For the most part, the problem isn't that rents have risen too high or that they're rising too rapidly, but that rent is too expensive given tenants' stagnant income and that landlord is squeezing extra rental income by neglecting repairs. So kind of more so these issues associated with slumification. Rent abolition, meanwhile, can activate tenants' imagination because it's imminent in the most inspiring tactics and demands of the moment in our movement. So tactics like rent strikes and home expropriations, if made permanent, are what we're thinking about when we talk about rent abolition. Demands like rent cancellation, if made permanent, are rent abolition. And this is kind of already the direction that our movement is going right now. It's more straightforward also to relate rent abolition to the demands of other contemporary social movements. The language of abolition is activated already by the Black liberation struggle demand for carceral abolition and the immigration liberation struggle for border abolition. I feel like the past several summers we're really talking about one abolition or another pretty consistently. That's kind of the radical horizon we're talking about. And likewise, decolonization fundamentally requires ending landlordism, and rent is the hinge between the landlord and tenant struggle. And I've got other comments I would make on the connection between rent abolition and carceral abolition, but this is what I've got on the slideshow here, so we can save that for the discussion and comments. So thanks, folks.
Thank you. Also super interesting and useful, and awesome, like amazing that we get to be having these conversations in this group right now. You don't get to do that every day. But again, if you had any questions about that, feel free to pop them in the chat or write them down for later. And I will throw it over to Frank now.
All right. Thank you so much, Julianne and Mark and Talia. So I am going to talk about I'm going to try to kind of like organize what I'm going to say to you all in 3 different points. My first point is going to be about thinking about the landowning class. And the second point is about rethinking the question, and I think the other speakers have spoken to, why is the rent so damn high? It is too damn high, and why? My computer's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so tell me if I have to move. And then my third point is going to be about who is barred from land ownership and why. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about like Marx and Marxism, and I don't think that people need to read Marx or be Marxists, but I do think that these ideas have a very large influence on radical movements in the United States and all over the world. And if you want, it's hard for me to do Zoom because I always want to see people's reactions, but if anybody wants to like drop in the chat, like whether you have learned about like Marxism or socialism or not, I would be interested to hear. You could just say yes or no. But anyway, so yeah, for those who are not familiar, or just to get on the same page together, the basic kind of structure of a Marxist or socialist or communist analysis is that capitalist society is structured by the exploitation of workers or proletarians by capitalists. So workers work for a wage, and in doing so, they enrich the capitalists. All right, we're getting some yeses. So, and kind of one of the points of the analysis of capitalism is that wage work is super new, like historically, like it's only been around for a few hundred years. And like, if you go back a ways, like the form of working and receiving a wage for your hourly work just wasn't there. And so that's like really weird and new and needs to be understood, and like how it comes about. Unfortunately, this element of a Marxist or socialist critique of capitalism has led people to believe that the most important contradiction in society is between workers and capitalists. Whereas I don't think that that's even true when you look at like Marx's writings. But this, this is, for example, why potentially like Bernie Sanders, like kind of just wasn't able to really go far enough on race, because ultimately he's really deeply kind of class reductionist socialist. But anyway, so I want to talk about something that Marx did say, although it's not necessarily important whether or not Marx said it, but he actually said that capitalism was composed not just by the working class and the capitalist class, but by a third class, which is the landowning class. So he actually said there's 3 classes, not 2 classes. And very few people really take up this part, and it's probably because it's like way in like Capital Volume 3, and like it's whatever, it's not really in the initial like things that people usually read. But it's really interesting, and it's really fascinating to think about structurally how the landowning class functions in the capitalist mode of production. So the theory of the landowning class says that landowners are the class of people that owns the title to land in capitalism. So speaking of this issue of property that Mark is raising, that the reason why capitalism requires a landowning class, and that landowning class be reproduced and always there, is because land has to be owned. The institution of private property has to exist and be maintained. Somebody needs to own the land. Why do they need to own the land? Because if they didn't, people would be able to live with and from the land, and they wouldn't have to go work for a wage. So the very creation of people who have to work for capitalists depends on the existence of a landowning class to contain land and prevent people from, getting any autonomy from the system. So in capitalism, landowners are passive receivers of rent. And if we're talking about tenants and home renters, in most apartment and home rental relationships, there's actually a property management company, which functions as a capitalist company that does all this stuff. They collect the rent, they like fix your place, like all that stuff. And they then collect your rents and they turn over amount to the actual owner of the title to land. And I think it's very useful to note that there's these really two different roles in apartment rentals and home rentals, and that I know like a lot of you doing organizing have noticed. Like, you know, who are you fighting with? Are you fighting with the property management company? Are you fighting with the actual owner of the title to land? Are those two entities connected or are they not? These are all very important when you're trying to pressure different people. Okay, so then the question of like, I'm sorry, is someone keeping time for me? What? Let me see. We started at 1. Okay, I'm just a few minutes. So the second point I wanted to talk about is why is the rent so damn high? So a thing that kind of comes from this theory of the landowning class is that the rent is really tied to how much tenants can pay. You can't actually raise the rent above what your tenants can pay, which seems really obvious, but it's not how housing advocates usually think about why rent is rising. So I live in San Francisco. The political spread basically goes from like the YIMBY movement, and if anyone doesn't know about that, we can probably like shit talk them later. Who says that like the reason rents are so high is because we don't have enough housing. So build as much market rate housing as possible to get rid of all the zoning regulations, and then like it'll solve the housing crisis. And then on the other side, you have progressive housing, like nonprofits and stuff, who are saying the rent is so high because you don't have enough rent regulation, and you don't have enough tenant protections. And like, so the thing is that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But so rent regulations and rent protections. And it was interesting that Mark was talking about this group of white tenants passing a lot of the rent regulations in LA. Some research that I've done is there's some people who have kind of aggregated data and shown that rent control benefits white communities more than communities of color proportionally. So anyway, there was some like really kind of like weird local autodidacts that did this research in San Francisco trying to look at why rents go up in San Francisco. And there's also been some academics that have looked at this question. And the thing is, it doesn't correlate to housing stock, like the YIMBYs would say. When rents don't go up when housing stock goes down, which is what they would think. And rents going up does not correlate with rent regulations. Rent control does not prevent housing from going up. So what does correlate with rents going up is the rise in average median income of households. So when the average income of households goes up, rents go up across the board, and vice versa. When the average median income goes down, rents go down. And so again, it sounds really obvious, but I think that it kind of changes our understanding of things. But the reason we might not want to consider that is because it kind of like messes with tenant organizing. Like, well, rents are up high because the rents go up because sorry everybody. Okay, so because you don't want to say that rents are high because people can pay. Well, then of course what's the problem? If rents are going up because people can pay, then what's the big problem? Well, I'm just going to share one graphic. You guys see this? It's like a little graph. Okay. It's the wealth and income gap, especially in very high rent cities, is just like out of control. So you see here in San Francisco, the difference between the amount of people who are making over $75,000 and everybody else is just it's just huge. So like, it's like it's not like tiered or anything. It's like there's these really rich people who can just whatever, like dump $4,000 a month on rent with their friend. And then there's everybody else who like, there's just no way they can do that. But rents rising are really going with this existing and growing amount of people who can pay those rents. So it's really about, you know, displacement and a hierarchies within like the renter and land relationship, property relationship, you might say. Okay, let me go back. Exit screen sharing. I don't know if I know how to do that. Anybody? Stop sharing. Okay. So, so then we have to ask, what's going on with these hierarchies in relationships to land, to security of tenure? Who is my third question? Who is barred from land ownership and why? So if we go back to the idea that landowners have to exist in capitalism so that land is privately owned, which prevents people from living on it, with it, and from it, we have to note that racialized communities, and especially Black land ownership in the US, has been attacked since the moment like slavery ended. Every force of like the white political elite came in to prevent any kind of land distribution. And so W.E. Du Bois points out that white politicians were really explicit about it. Like they said that the former slaves had to be prevented from gaining land because it would jeopardize their role as cheap labor for capital. So, and then also Clyde Wood's like, you know, says so much amazing stuff kind of in this vein. And I really think the way he talks about that attack on like Black land ownership in the Reconstruction period as spatial fragmentation, so that like even when they had forced Black people to go back to work, they still actually dismembered their collective housing situations because they didn't want people to be close to each other, because that meant, you know, that people could organize and people could talk. Also, you know, indigenous land sovereignty, including the knowledge of how to live from the land in a way that would create some kind of autonomy from the colonial settler system, has been ceaselessly attacked since colonization. And I live here in occupied Ohlone coastal Miwok territory, and the struggle is happening here every day, ongoing. And I think a lot of us are probably familiar with the ways that you know, Black land wealth has been eradicated, or like not eradicated, but severely attacked through like the subprime crisis and on and on. I mean, we can talk for hours about it, but what's interesting is that the access to land and the security of tenure, it gives you a level of autonomy vis-a-vis the system, right? This is kind of like what this landowning class analysis offers, along with some of this other work. If you have somewhere to stay, you can quit your job if you need to, you can hold political meetings there, you can develop connections with your neighbors. And in a way, it's like all of this is okay in the system if, for example, you're like a white middle-class person who won't use that autonomy and that security to threaten the system as it stands. But for people who are more marginalized by the system, or who themselves are rejecting the system, land is too dangerous. It strengthens potential resistance. So I was kind of trying to figure out how that, like, how we can think about that with tenant organizing, because in a way, like the question of tenant organizing is that to some degree it's a consumer fight, like, because you're consuming an apartment, you have to buy that apartment every month. It's the consumption thing, you know. So if it's, so long as it's about like alliances of tenants to fight for lower rents, to some degree it's kind of like on the level of consumer politics, which I'm sure some people have a critique of. But then there's this other mode of where you're interfacing directly with like land ownership and the landowning class and land ownership as an institution, and what that fight can gain, what you can gain from that fight, what people can gain from the fight, and the ability to stay in place and be rooted in place. So I guess I'll just leave it there, and I'm really interested to hear comments and questions from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was also super awesome and really helpful, really good contextualization from all the presenters. So now we've just mostly got some time for question and discussion. So go ahead and you can type stack in the chat or use the raise hand tool if you've got a question for any of the presenters. Sure, go ahead, Rose.
I just wanted to say, I thought the point that, Julian, I thought your point about, you know, the slogan like decommodify housing and the reasons to move away from that were super interesting. I think, as you say, like the problem with us using that kind of language is that people immediately start talking about like community land trusts and stuff like this, like things that can only happen on a very small scale. And so I just like, I think you're right that like abolish rent. I mean, one, it doesn't have the word decommodify in it, which most people don't know what that means. But also just that it's so clear that that's not something that can be done piecemeal, and you don't want to be like taking one building off of the market or something, as much as that is a significant material win for the tenants who live there. So I just wanted to say I thought that was really really useful. Thanks. So that wasn't a question. I'm sorry I was that asshole. I'm sorry.
I think it's great if we use this time for discussion as much as back and forth between the presenters and the other folks.
Jeremiah, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, I definitely echo that this was incredibly helpful. The point in particular about like land tenure equaling autonomy, and that like, this occurs to me that this is like a struggle across justice movements, is that the people who are most dispossessed are the ones who are struggling. And so the people who experience the greatest precarity are also the ones with the people with the fewest securities from which to fight are the ones who are waging this fight. And so I would be curious to hear from all three of y'all about like, how do you share how do y'all share this information with the tenants with whom you're struggling, alongside whom you're struggling? And like, what are potential ways of building this political framework, this larger framework for the struggle that y'all have experienced?
Great question. If we want to just go in order of the presenters, Mark, do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I was talking big shit about culture, right? That I think that having a discussion about rent abolition is at one of its roots is both material and culture. I see them as being interrelated. And in Black history, that project, and when we talk about Clyde Woods and others, that project of Black abolition and Black sovereignty has been rooted in the concept of the promised land, right? And so this phrase has been used by liberals to they weakened it by saying that it was paradise, but that's not what the promised land is, and that's not how Black people have used it in the past. The promised land is described in the language of paradise, but it's really a concept of Black sovereignty. And the reason why it's so dangerous in the United States is because it's taking up a concept of Black sovereignty that uses the same God to make it legitimate. And that's why it's always different than others. So if it's like, if we were talking about sovereignty somewhere else, like what Garvey was doing, then there's like, give a shit, go. If you want to go produce somewhere in Liberia, you can go in and do it. When we start talking about having a concept of sovereignty that's on the same land, and this is the reason why at root, indigenous and Black radicalisms are fought so hard, is because they're trying to make claims of sovereignty in the same place. And in order for us to get access to these conversations about sovereignty and land, we got to do it through culture, right? And so then it's to discuss those things wherever you find those kind of interactions. And so we can do it in a lot of cultural artifacts, right? We could do them in poems. You can have these conversations with tenants and read a poem by Langston Hughes, Ballad of the Landlord. It's this wonderful poem, goes through these three different voices. It was written, I believe, it's like 1941 or 1940. And they're great places to start having discussions about property, tenant landlord law, expectations, but also like the powers of the government. I mean, that's just an excellent poem to do that. Another one to do it is Gwendolyn Brooks' Kitchenette Building. is another kind of cultural place to go. But then also movies, even movies that we think have a lot of radical potential. Has anybody seen remember the movie Free State of Jones? Yeah, right. I was just watching it yesterday, right? And I kind of forgot about it. So, you know, Matthew McConaughey is the white savior, but he's in this, but he's with this, Matthew McConaughey is a part of this it's this white and black, poor white Southerners who are defectors from the Confederate Army and some fugitive slaves, right, are bound together against essentially the Confederate Army from confiscating their property, right? And so then they create this new sovereign nation because they say, we don't have any nation. We're not a part of the Union. We're not a part of the Confederates. We're going to establish our own sovereign territory. We're going to call it the Free State of Jones. And so there's this scene, right, where McConaughey is on the steps in front of this shack, and he's basically given the Declaration of Independence, their Declaration of Independence. And so they have these principles that they say, right? And one of them seems so common sense, right? One of the main ones, it was one of the first ones, because what they were battling was the confiscation of their corn, of their cotton. These soldiers were showing up, they were supposed to take 10%, but they were taking everything, everybody's hogs. People were gonna starve in the winter, and so they rebelled. And again, this connects back to my point about the Shays Rebellion. Like, we have these critical moments of a threat on property that's connected to our very survival. And so one of the foundational tenets, like the principles that McConaughey gives on the steps of his shack, he says, whatever a man puts in the ground intends, so shall he reap, right? And it seems very common sense. Like, yeah, of course. Like, you know, if I go outside and I put some corn in the ground and I bury it and I tend to it and it grows, then that should be mine, right? But the thing about it though is, you know where that comes from? You know who articulated that? John Locke. John Locke was the 17th century theorist who articulated that in terms of a modern conception of property. And you know what John Locke also did? His philosophies were at the basis of the constitutions of the modern nation state. Constitutions and nation states that did two things. One is they justified the dispossession of indigenous people, and next they justified the enslavement of Africans. So that concept of natural rights, right, seems like it's so common sense, but it's actually really dangerous, right? Because indigenous people don't think about property that way. Yeah, you put the corn in the ground, right? You put the corn in the ground, but what did it take for that corn to grow? You asked somebody to help you build a fence to protect it. When you got attacked, your homies had to come and show up and help you protect it from getting stolen. When the weather got bad, they helped you build a shelter. When you needed to harvest it, you also had to do it with other people. So what happens in something like, just like the Free State of Jones, is it smuggles in these old Anglo ideas of property that seem like they're common sense, but are actually denying things like indigenous sovereignty and indigenous ways of thinking about the land. And so they're great places to just stop and have a conversation. Why is this assumption here? And why are we not questioning it? And when we do start questioning it, what kind of other possibilities do we have? And then we start to try to recreate where are other places in my life where I've said shit like this before? And so we can always do it through right at a cultural point that's very accessible. We don't have to get into a bunch of theory. It's just, you just take one excerpt from John Locke, watch Free State of Jones, and have a conversation. And that's radical. You see, so that's the way I do it. That's one way.
Thank you. I'll throw it to Julian.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, to maybe kind of hone in on like, you know, having, say, an organizing conversation with an agitated tenant, like how you kind of jump from, you know, the day-to-day issues to rent abolition. Like, I feel like, you know, it's a pretty common sentiment that just like, you know, whatever the rent is, it's unbearable, or like the landlord just isn't doing anything, you know, to you know, actually even justify the land ownership. You know, this kind of point that that Frank raised in terms of like the landlord as the passive recipient of the rent income, right? I think, you know, these kinds of you know, common conversation topics that come up just in a one-on-one or what have you, you know, door knocking, etc. Like, that's a great opportunity to just kind of plant the seed of, yeah, why do we even have rent at all? And to Mark's point, I think, you know, being able to pull on, you know, the relevant like cultural touchstones for the folks you're speaking with and for yourself, that kind of makes it more organic and kind of come from a less out of left field perspective. Although my experience also is that, if even, just coming straight up with the communism, like doesn't always, alienate people too much. So, I find that it often works for me to say, like, I hear where you're coming from. I think about it a little bit differently. I'm a communist. To me, I think we shouldn't even have rent. And to me, I guess the other thing I'll say is, like, I try to kind of bring in these kinds of points, doubts about, really whether decommodifying housing is going to hype up people, and kind of put in this alternate language out there. Just really any opportunity I have in tenant movement spaces. So, like, I remember about a year ago, we were having in Oakland, like a kind of a people's assembly focused on tenant issues. And I just kind of, we were kind of talking about, what are our, big stretch goals for what we would want to get for tenants. And I was saying no more rent was kind of my, really, we just don't want to pay rent anymore. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to just kind of slip that stuff in there when, one way or another in whatever conversation.
Thank you, and Frank.
I'm really sorry. I forget what the question was. Should I just talk, or do you want to say? Could you say it again?
Yeah, I can say it again. It was just a question about, like, how do you
talk off the cuff about what the other people said?
It was just a question about how you share the this information, this really important framework with tenants who maybe have been brought up in a framework that enforces private property and upholds a system of ownership.
Okay, well, so that makes sense with the responses. I had kind of like two thoughts along those lines while the other presenters were talking. One is, when Mark was talking about how much the ideal of private property is kind of Lockean ideal, has to be like reinforced and reinserted. And Julian says it's kind of easy to get there with people if you're open. It just makes me think of, like, the intensity with which any alternative conception of property is attacked, like, is evidence of how easily I think people are willing to go there, especially when they're engaged in something around collective practice. It's very hard to get there just in the mind. And, like, I mean, I believed this before, but for me, working with, like, homeless encampments and in, like, Occupy Oakland and in like houseless organizations and stuff, I see how quickly people can start to act collectively when they thought before they didn't want to. And that's the thing that's very hard in contemporary cities, is that everything is set up to make it so that it's inconvenient to work with other people. And that's where the sort of tenant organizing is very different in really highly capitalized cities versus, like, maybe more rural areas, is that in cities, it's like, it's easier to get your food from a food bank or, cheap food bought or borrow some money to buy some food than it is to, like, have an urban garden that is, like, on appropriate. Like, it makes it so hard to do collective stuff together. And so it's very hard to push back against that. And that's intentional in some way, but from the system, and I just think that that's interesting, how hard the system has to prevent us from doing these things, because we would do them if we could.
Awesome. Thanks, all three of you. I've got Nico up on the stack.
I think Ricky was before me.
Ricky came off stack.
Oh, okay. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks everyone for everything so far. This is like an awesome conversation. Kind of going off something that Mark, you started out talking about, how a lot of this stuff is just, like, hard to find in the historical record, these examples. And I was thinking about something I read recently from Nick Estes, where he talks about terminal narratives, which are these, like, obsessions with death, disappearance, and absence, rather than, like, a visible presence and, like, a constant challenge. that just being present or continuing to exist and resist is something that is the goal of capitalism. And kind of just thinking about how does that affect our organizing? How do we think about sort of these narratives of like tenant struggle or tenants being exploited or abused? How do we play into that narrative in ways that actually end up being, negative for a movement? How do we kind of use those as potential points of solidarity when we outreach to tenants? And does that end up creating a inherent dynamic that that we actually don't want to be creating? So I'm just kind of curious, how do we start to think about that in regards to our outreach, in regards to our kind of internal definition of what we stand for? Yeah.
Was that a question for all three or one specifically?
Have at it.
Do we want to go opposite order? Frank, would you like to try?
I think I need you to, so you're saying something, I think my internet's a little fucked up. You said something negative happens that we need to consider in these movements for autonomy, but I missed what the negative thing was.
That these kind of, we oftentimes, we find the narratives that are around tenants or around poor and working class people to be terminal narratives, in that they're focused on the displacement, they're focused on the abuses, they're focused on the exploitation. And these are powerful points of like, sort of like our material conditions that we're responding to, and we can establish solidarity around them. But does that also create kind of an inherent connection or dynamic in like the founding of our relationship with one another as tenants that can create issues in our organizing?
Okay, I hear you. That's a good question. And I'll try not to talk too much about it, but I feel like for the organizers who can and who don't already know the histories of places that are getting gentrified, learning the history really helps with that, because displacement, before it happens, as far as I can tell, it usually requires a really serious attack and like raising of communities in the areas that then we see in the last 20 years become like nicely gentrified, like in a sort of impersonate, just people, rich people buying houses. It's not their fault. But before that stuff happens, usually those same communities are like attacked. And if you acknowledge that, you acknowledge how strong those communities are, that they have fought and they have like grabbed and they have held on to it, and they have done so much. And that people put together about San Francisco, and there's all these oral histories with people who had like Black people who moved from the South or were children of people who moved from the South, who really had developed these really incredible communities that were then just like completely raised by the city government. And in those neighborhoods then, now in the last 20 years has been gentrification of lists. It's like, oh, that's too bad, they're getting displaced. But before the displacement, they had to be like attacked because they were so strong. So I don't know, for me, that helps me kind of like have a different orientation to it.
Thank you. You cut out a little bit there, but I think at least on my end, I got most of it. So we'll go to Julian next.
Yeah, I guess I'll say, I mean, I think I agree with that point, Frank, that, and I think that, this kind of also keys in with one of Mark's points about, kind of drawing on the cultural resources of abolitionism to, kind of activate in the current moment. I think that's a compelling point. I guess the other kind of thing that I think about is like, especially when we're first meeting folks, on the one hand, you want to engage with them in terms of like what's going on for them that, could be changed. So that's typically going to be, something negative, right? But you also, if you're just talking about the negative, they're going to be like, well, what can we actually, what can we even do about it? They'll go into a, fatalistic standpoint. And I feel like, maybe ultimately like this kind of issue with terminal narratives is the fatalism here. And I think, what brings people into the tenant union, what brings people into relation is, principles of solidarity. And then also just kind of like just the moments that you have, just enjoying the conversation with somebody you're just meeting and all that kind of stuff. So I think, we need to work with the negative material, because that in a lot of cases, that's going to, make the difference between the tenant that, is motivated to actually do something versus not. Like, I think a lot of people will have encountered, folks that are like, yeah, I think, the union's cool and all, but I don't have any issues right now, so I'm all right. So you kind of need that part, but that's not enough. And I think, having a sense of like the positives, the victories, the solidarity, bringing enjoyment and pleasure into the work that we do, just kind of enjoying being with one another, like those are all ways to kind of balance that out.
Yeah, Nico, I think this is an excellent question. It makes me think of a few things. One is, so there's a book, I have it around here somewhere. It's a collection of, oh, here it goes. It's a, crashing into all my shit. It's a book on, it's called Watts, The Aftermath. And it's a collection of basically oral histories, interviews from residents of Watts in the aftermath of the Watts Rebellion. And what's so interesting about this was like, he's like a journalist, and I think he did some stuff at UCLA and back in the day. But what was so interesting is when I opened this book up on the kind of first, he does a long excerpt from one of his subjects named James in 1969. And the James is just he's just a cat and Watts. And he's talking about, essentially he's talking about the promised land. And so he's saying that like, he's imagining Black history through this kind of biblical narrative, but really at a moment of a lot of Black nationalism, where people were, and even now historians understand the Watts Rebellion as a nationalist rebellion, right? But there's a much deeper and a much older reliance on biblical narratives as a form of freedom dreaming, what Robin Kelley calls freedom dreaming. And so the reason why freedom dreaming is so important, right? And in terms of what you're saying so that we can fight terminal narratives, is because terminal narratives are not just narratives that we produce, but they're narratives that essentially that are oppressors, but even people that want to help us. So like me, I'm an academic. Academics create terminal narratives. It's kind of our bread and butter. It's how we stay relevant, is by creating a terminal narrative about something. As soon as I show up to something, if I show up to urban planning at UCLA and I show up saying, hey, I have this great dream for something, they'd be like, shut up, right? The thing I have to give them is I have to give them a problem. It's our method. You got to do a literature review, you got to find the problem, right? But as soon as you start defining problems, you start to define the boundaries of our imagination, right? Because what happens is, what if there could be multiple problems. So for example, the way that like some terminal narratives are really problematic is sometimes they could completely obscure what a primary cause is, right? So for example, my critique is that the terminal narrative about the city has been about like how it's become segregated. And so in order to save it, we have to desegregate the city. But what that runs cover, and then we use that as a discussion, this is really the liberal point of view. We use that to then say, okay, for us to have racial equality in this country, we have to get desegregation. And so we're using this project of Black, what we think is Black liberation, right, to run cover for this other primary issue, which is also creating difference under racial capitalism, which is property. So that we can have an entire book about how segregation came along and how it did this and how it did that, but then there's never any discussion. So what what we say? We say, when we get past segregation, then we'll get freedom. And that's it. Freedom is just this kind of openness, and it can float around and we're just gonna do whatever we want, But no, freedom is structured by property. That's the way our liberty is defined in this country. It's a settler freedom. And then we never have that discussion. So that Black people, then we end up go running into Baldwin Hills to go buy a house, and we think we're free. And that's it. Freedom is just this kind of openness, and it can float around and we're just gonna do whatever we want, But no, freedom is structured by property. That's the way our liberty is defined in this country. It's a settler freedom. And then we never have that discussion. So that Black people, then we end up go running into Baldwin Hills to go buy a house, and we think we're free. when we really just bought into a freedom that says that I can exclude people from this space, so that I can have my nice house in Baldwin Hills, I can go to the NAACP and make it seem like I'm some nice bourgeois Black person who succeeded while I'm kicking homeless people out of my neighborhood. So that's one danger of terminal narratives, is that they end up defining the problem, obscuring other problems, and then they also end up defining what freedom is. So if I can control the terminal narrative, then I can control the freedom narrative. So they're always connected. And so that's why I think this question is so important. The other thing is the danger of pragmatism. And this is a huge, I mean, Nico's in my local. So, I mean, bro, I mean, it's just because people are in crisis, you know, so you show up and says, man, these dudes just show up to my house, they beat me down and threw me out. And if we got to show up, and then it's like, we got to take care of the pragmatic right now, right? Like we got to deal with what's pragmatic. The problem with pragmatism is that really, and don't you always notice powerful people always want to be pragmatic. So when I do some shit at UCLA, if I do some presentation or something, it's always some politician or something that's like, well, that's not pragmatic, you know? Pragmatic is what the powerful can already do. What the fuck do I give about pragmatism? I don't want to do what we can already do. I want to do something fucking different, you know? So that's the danger of pragmatism. So if we're going to organize with people, we do need to, like, obviously, just like the Panthers, like we got to feed people, but you're not going to listen to me if you're starving. So let's get some breakfast on the table. But the next thing is then let's talk about freedom. And so that's always, we can't allow pragmatism to be the language of our politics. We can't allow pragmatism to be the limits of our discussions. And we cannot deny the rank and file members a space to do radical imagining. It can't just all be about what we call casework. It can't just all be about, so this question of terminal narratives is so important because that's what survives. How in the hell, right? What slave smuggled out of the Bible this story of the promised land, right? Hidden away in the forest all this time, right? You could be murdered for it. You can have, just the punishment. And through all this like uncoordinated action, this idea that seems so sexy and just kind of like moving around, and it gets out of enslavement and it travels all over the country so that it can go from an exoduster in the late 19th century to James and Watts in 1969. It survived all of that time just because it's a dream, right? Those are the things that are important. So like all of this stuff that we're talking, all of this a lot of this stuff it's gonna end up being dust in 100 years. But there's gonna be some idea that we produce together that's gonna survive, right? Some kind of story, some kind of dream that's gonna live on, hopefully, for 100 years, 200 years, if we can figure it out. You see what I'm saying? So that's why, yeah, so it's just, great question.
Thank you. This is amazing. I've got Charles and Ricky on stack, and then I'm guessing that's going to get us to time. Our next workshop start in about 20 minutes. But while they're asking their questions, Mark, Julian, and Frank, if you haven't already, if you can drop somewhere that folks could contact you if they continue to have further questions. And Charles, if you want to go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Mark, Julian, Frank, I want to thank you all for, fantastic presentations and a really compelling discussion that we've had since then. I guess I want to circle back to something that you pointed out, I think very astutely near the start of your presentation, Julian, which is all these different ways in which, rental housing as a commodity, actually manifests itself in terms of actual sort of, transactions and property relations. And it occurred to me that, the majority of these are, sort of written into specifically capitalist property relations, right? And any sort of demand to abolish rent in some ways implies obviating those. But there are two in particular, right? Which is housing as a built commodity for which the landlord pays the builder, and also a commodity that deteriorates through use and exposure for which the landlord pays workers to repair, which I feel like, those are speaking to a division of labor just in like modern industrial society that in some ways goes deeper than just the sort of legal framework under which property relations exist. and which, you know, I kind of have a tough time envisioning how sort of rent abolition alone gets around the fact that, like, you do have this division of labor, you have specialist knowledge that is required for construction, for maintenance, for repair. And I guess my question, you know, in particular to you, Julian, though I'm interested in what all of you have to say about it, is like, how do we envision that changing, right? And concretely, like, how do we get there from where we are now? One sort of particular example that I found inspiring in many ways is Misión Vivienda in Venezuela, where, like, you know, you've had the construction of like a large amount of social housing that seems to be very rooted in like neighborhood-based communes, and which like works in close coordination and a very participatory way with like the sort of building trades unions. But I don't know too many details of that. And of course, like, any attempt to replicate that here, I think, would run up against the fact that, like, a lot of the building trades unions in the US are like quite reactionary. So like, yeah, that's sort of just what I was wondering here.
Yeah, I can try to address some of that briefly. I mean, I guess like there's kind of two aspects to my sort of concern around the notion of decommodifying housing. Like, I'm not saying we should throw it out at all. In fact, I actually think we can learn quite a lot by really thinking about what that includes in full. And it's more than just, I think typically when we talk about it, we're talking about, you know, taking things off the market. But what we're talking about is the sales market or the mortgage market or, you know, something like that. We're not talking about these other components. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right that we need to think about, you know, like ultimately, if we're talking about eliminating it as a built commodity or as a commodity that's maintained and repaired, we're also talking about, you know, liberating the wage labor of builders, carpenters, construction workers. So that means solidarity, finding ways to build solidarity with people organizing the labor movement, which of course there's a lot of difficulties with that given the, you know, reactionary stance of a lot of the trade unions in that sector. So that's kind of one part. I think that's a huge challenge I don't have an answer on. I think, but broadly speaking, you know, kind of related to that, you know, that's the mutual aid housing cooperative to me seems like the most provocative of the so-called decommodified housing forms, precisely because it kind of integrates a way of dealing with, you know, both the market side stuff as well as the labor side stuff. I'm going to think your example also points to that. In terms of how that connects to rent abolition, I mean, I think, you know, as I kind of say, I think full decommodification and full rent abolition ultimately amount to the same thing but what we need to think about is who they agitate and how. I think maybe you're pointing to there's limitations if we kind of take out the imagination associated with, you know, decommodification. I think, you know, partly this also kind of comes up to a, you know, a sense of like, you know, what different folks in this may actually think, you know, massive social transformation like. To me, I'm inclined to think it's ultimately going to much more be reliant on mass uprising in, you know, a wide sector of struggles. And so it's important to emphasize the most militant and agitational actions. And I think we've seen, you know, just how empowering the you know, militant struggles over the summer have been, and how much that's kind of gave energy to other sectors in the social movements. So yeah, I mean, I think that's also kind of partly why I think it's important to focus on rent abolition. I mean, people just I think we're going to need, at the very least, to maybe kind of, you know, going back to one of Mark's points, if we end up you know, needing to have these changes come down through the different structures of governance, that's going to happen through uprising at different scales. And so, you know, what part are we putting the emphasis on? But I don't know, maybe others have actually comments on this too.
Yeah, Mark, looks like you wanted to touch on it.
Yeah, mine's just like a theoretical kind of thing, because so I'm thinking about like Lefebvre's work, right? So thinking about spatial theory, part of what we're doing here in terms of like, I get funny about planning, right? Because if we look at Lefebvre's work in spatial theory, planning is a part of what he calls abstract space. And that abstract space is like the space of capitalism. It's how capitalism externalizes itself, spatializes itself in the world. So one way of thinking about that is like zoning, right? Or the construction field. Geography is a big one. Mapping is a big abstract space in capitalism. So what we're doing when we're making a project of liberation is we're actually breaking down those abstractions. And as we break down those abstractions, we then break down the divisions of labor that those abstractions made. So, but the major part of this is that we're not just, and this is going to Julian's point, like, yeah, we need the militant actions, but we're not going to get liberation. And this is Lefebvre's point. We're not going to get we're not going to get liberation unless we externalize it. We have to create liberation in space. So we can't just have the principles and then have these political fights without rebuilding, because the space that we're in now is capitalist space. Our housing arrangements are built and understood in capitalist terms. The ways that our apartments have these specialized rooms and pockets are productions of capitalism. The way that our geographies are spatialized are products of capitalism. So as we start to fight back against that, we're gonna start breaking down these abstractions of space, but then we're also gonna start breaking down the built environment because they're not gonna make sense to us anymore, right? So when we start living differently, when we abolish rent, then as we live this life of abolished rent, we may not have a plan, right? But we do have a struggle and a collective practice. And then we're going to start rebuilding this society based off those principles. We don't know what that's going to look like, and we ought not to know what it looks like because we're going to build it together, right? And that's what's dangerous about it, because it's an uncertainty. There's an undeniable and inherent uncertainty in liberation, and that's what's so fucking dangerous about it. But in order to struggle together in that kind of uncertainty, you do it every day. You do it with your family, you do it with your partner, right? Because that's what love is, and that's why we have to be friends. Because at the basis of any liberation project is this radical faith in each other. Because we can't have guarantees. We're not going to have a plan. We just say, I love you. We're here. I believe in you, and we're going to go, and we're going to move, and we're going to build together. But we can use Lefebvre and that spatial theory to ground ourselves in terms of, if I'm going to use the word planning, that can move us in a direction of saying what we have to do. So what we have to do as part of that is we got to start building something else. And that's why I love these like freedom zones that people make fun of, folks are there, oh, that's so silly. They're these autonomous zones, they take them over and yada, yada. They're wonderful. Those are wonderful things to do because those are the experiments that we have to start undertaking, even if they fail. But this is much of what, public housing was an example of that. That public housing had a whole bunch of problems, but public housing is a good thing to study. And modernism is a good thing to study to answer those kind of questions and to start figuring out like, how are we gonna, I would say public housing, but also look at some of the feminist scholarship around public housing. I'm thinking particularly of The Politics of Public Housing by, I can't remember the author's name right now, but it's The Politics of Public Housing. He's looking at like Black feminism in public housing, but also look at Don Parson, Making a Better World. And then he had a newer book called Public Los Angeles. There's a chapter in there on housework, on domesticity and public housing. Those, and that's very much about division of labor. And so those are some spaces where we can see how the built environment, you can get together with some architecture friends and stuff like that, and start to think about relationships between the built environment and questions of division of labor and gender in particular.
Okay, I want to go real quick to Ricky's question. We're getting close to time, so if people have to go or want to break before the last workshop, go ahead. But Ricky, if you want to go in, then that'll be our last question.
Honestly, I went back and forth about whether I wanted to ask this because I think it comes down to kind of an obnoxious provocation. But Mark's points, particularly about how our narratives bound our imagination and the way we look at the problems, as well as all three of your points about essentially disciplines, right? How we understand what the problems are. I was wondering, I had originally just wanted to ask if you think that there's a debate about the usefulness of gentrification as a frame, but it kind of ties to these, right? Because when Julian was talking about how maybe gentrification is not really what we're looking at in every case, I keep thinking about how, as social scientists, some of us are actually pushing forward these kinds of narratives as the way to understand what our problems in front of us are. Don't necessarily want you to get into an argument about gentrification unless you want to, because it would be fun, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I know this is like the most annoying thing to ask people if they think gentrification is like the way that we should be talking. Urbanists in particular love to just like fight about how it's either like not real or maybe this is a social science problem. But
yeah. Frank, do you want to start?
I'm also in the social sciences, although I'm in a corner where everybody accepts gentrification as existing in a negative thing. So I don't know who the people are who are arguing against. They're the right-wing people, or they're like the more radical people.
Urban planners, market urbanists, you know.
Okay, who are like, it's good when nice businesses come and that kind of stuff.
Or they just say it's about like neighborhood change as the language.
Oh, yeah, like, neighborhoods always. Yeah, I think gentrification is a great word and concept, because piss off people who are experiencing gentrification, like they use it. It has like a nasty thing. Like it makes you feel bad if someone's like, you gentrifier. And I feel like that's useful personally. I don't know how.
Yeah, I agree. It's totally useful. I think my main issue is there's been an overemphasis on it. And I think that happens historically because a lot of the movement organizations that have brought the movement to prominence in our current period have been responding to gentrification. But I think we're at a point where the movement's big enough that we need to be looking at like what's actually happening in, for the majority of tenants, and building strategies based on, stretching our movement beyond the place where we've had historical bases. And that's going to mean confronting things other than gentrification, even though that's a very real problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, let me say this. I don't have any beef yet, right? Because I haven't started in my department. Give me a few years there and I'll probably be way more pissed about gentrification, like, just having to deal with it. But I think the key to a term that tries to identify a problem is, at least for working class and poor people and unhoused people, taking up the term of gentrification is not to, like, let's say as an organizer, I'm asked to go to a panel or do something, and somebody asks me to talk, and I bring this term in from outside this community. I need to ask, what's the problem with a neoliberal scholarship in the US, at least, is that we do literature reviews and they're stupid. And the reason why I think literature reviews are stupid is because it's very easy to find a problem. All I got to do is I can go to the liquor store right now. There's an encampment outside my liquor store on Vermont and 93rd, and they're turning up every day. They're out there drinking. They got a speaker out there. It's a community. You can go chill out. And I'll just go roll over there and I say, yo, what's going on? What's your problem? That's a literature review right there, but we don't do that, and that's not institutionalized. So I think with something like gentrification, it's allowing our communities to define what the problem is. And because Nico's comment in I saw you, Nico. So Nico's comment made me think of this. If we allow urban economists or urban planners sometimes to define some of these terms, even though we have overlap, like also, if we have this thing called gentrification, it's about something like neighborhood change, but they're trying to smuggle in a concept of urban ecology, what Nico was saying in terms of it's just a natural process, then that's a problem, right? But if we allow our communities to define what the problem is, then it implies a different understanding of urban change and urban development. Because if I can go down the street and they're not going to say something like urban ecology, but what are they going to say? They're going to say, oh, the man is doing this or some shit, we're going to have, but that's essentially what it is. I mean, that's what I want to hear, because they don't believe in a natural kind of an organism that is the city, because they see the power struggles and the problems. No, that cop right there told me I had to leave. This happened, da-da-da. They see that because they live that power every day. So if we're allowing our communities to define the problem in these terms, identifying like, what it is, and then what are the implications about the mechanisms of change and the theory of the city, you know, whatever that is happening at a grassroots level. And then, here's the thing, and it's not going to be perfect. Let's not romanticize, not romanticize like working class people. We're full of bullshit and homophobia and all this kind of crap that we got to get at. But when you meet people there, I mean, folks have a theory there that's pretty fucking sharp. And so when we take these terms like gentrification, yeah, we can throw them around. I mean, if they want to, if that's the phrase, if that's the term that that folks want to use, then we just make it dangerous. It's like the word nigga, you know, makes everybody else like take that shit and make it to where it's like so fucking uncomfortable they hold it in their mouth, and for them to have it in their mouth, it has to mean something. Like they can't just. It's to avoid elite capture, avoid elite capture of the term gentrification. And so the person I'm thinking about in terms of an article on elite capture, I'll put it in the link. His name is Olufemi Taiwo. He's my homie. He's at Georgetown. I'm gonna put it in the link in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. We'll keep the room open for people to grab emails and links and stuff out of the chat for a little bit. But otherwise, yeah, this is so amazing. And I hope that we keep having spaces like these in ATUN to have these discussions, because yeah, like I said, you don't just get to talk about this stuff with tenant organizers all the time. So this has been great. And thanks so much to the panelists and to everyone who's been participating.
Thanks, y'all.